afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is Aubrey McLaughlin and I am the Director of Alumni Professional Networks for the University of Maryland Alumni Association. We're excited that you're able to join us for today's webinar panel discussion surrounding LBGTQ and workplace inclusion. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development webinar series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve personal and professional goals. We have a lot of information to cover today, but we will be taking questions throughout the session. Please feel free to submit any questions using the Q&A box that's located on your control panel on the bottom of your screen. You can access the control panel by moving your cursor over the webinar browser. Now, before we get started, I'd like to introduce the president of Lambda Pride, which is our LBGTQ alumni network, Luis Ramirez. Luis currently works in nonprofits at Food and Friends in the DC community. While on campus, Luis was part of the Delta Epsilon Mu fraternity and worked at the Stamp Student Union. Please welcome Luis, who'd like to say a few words to welcome everyone today.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be part of this today, and I thank you all for participating today to learn a little bit more about this really important topic that affects a lot of us and really everybody in the workplace. So thank you so much. Another great way to stay connected to the University of Maryland alumni community and the school in general is to take advantage of the Alumni Association and the different affinity groups available, one of them being the LGBT affinity group. After some time of some inactivity, we are looking to relaunch this year and do a full scope of different events and different educational or different programming for everybody. And we're looking for people who are interested to either help plan or get involved or participate. So right now, what we have scheduled is on September 6th, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. back on campus at the LGBT Equity Center, we will be holding an information session about Lambda Pride and our goals and some of the things that we want to accomplish in the next couple of months leading into next year. So I invite you all to attend that. But if you're looking to just get involved in any way, in any capacity that you can right now, you can always reach out directly to me. I'll be sure to make sure my information is available for individuals to reach out and to really get involved. But we would love your support. We'd love you to come out and hang out with us and really make this a fun group for different alumni from Maryland. So thank you so much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Luis. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Lydia Woods. Lydia works in employer relations for our University of Maryland Career Center and the President's Promise on campus. She was recently appointed to the Career Center's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, charged with developing and evaluating the department's diversity and inclusion initiatives. Lydia has a background working as a program manager in nonprofit community outreach and workforce development for underprivileged communities. She also works on the board of directors for Movable Feast, which is a nonprofit that prepares and delivers meals and supports individuals with AIDS and life-threatening illnesses. So now I'll hand it over to Lydia to introduce the panel and get us started. Lydia, take it away. Lydia, I think you're muted.
I'm having all kinds of fun today, so I appreciate you all entrusting me with facilitating this conversation. I am actually having a moment that it's about to be fixed right now because I had some technical difficulties over here a little while ago. But guess what? We're all set. Thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all about this important topic. I would like to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to start with Jeremy Gombin-Sperling, who is a PhD student at the International Education Policy Program and a research assistant with a focus on diversity and inclusion in the Education Abroad Office at University of Maryland. Jeremy earned his bachelor's in psychology and religious studies at NYU, and later his master's, also in the IEP program at Maryland. His research interests focus around the intersections of language learning, identity development, and globalization. His professional career has revolved around international education and exchange programs, as well as initiatives on diversity and inclusion. He has worked as a language and cultural assistant as part of a national bilingual education program in Spain, and as an advisor and program manager in education abroad at the University of Maryland. There is also more information regarding Jeremy and his extensive experience in international education, as well as advocacy for LGBTQ community. During his time at the University of Maryland, he worked with the LGBTQ staff faculty association, a group dedicated to strengthening community and support for members of the university who are LGBTQ. He also particularly, this was interesting to me, worked at the State Department, where he coordinated the LGBTI Public Diplomacy Working Group, which, through collaboration with other bureaus and offices at the department, worked to support the advancement of human rights of LGBTQI persons through public diplomacy programming. I'd also like to introduce Holly Holub. Holly has got 14 years of experience in financial and technology consulting. She is a leader on her team, works with cross-functional teams, and communicates effectively with C-suite leadership. She also uses direct and indirect influence to accomplish her goals. She's got extensive experience working with various clients on project management, business development, process mapping, financial controls, and system development. Recently, actually last year, Holly and one of her colleagues at Accenture hosted a talk here at University of Maryland, and the topic was Out and Allied in the Workplace. So I wanted to let you know that she's actually served in this capacity with UMD colleagues previously. Moving on to our next panelist, Shigeru Sakurai is an expert in LGBTQ+ and diversity equity issues in higher education with over 15 years of experience in the field. And he's been at Maryland for over 8 years. Additionally, he has served as a community volunteer, student leader, and advocate. A couple of the things that stood out for me with Shigeru is that he is the first person in the country to receive a gender-neutral driver's license, and he is also the person who has established the Pronouns Day coming up in October, founded the first international, I should say, Pronouns Day to raise awareness about the importance of sharing and respecting personal pronouns. I'd also like to introduce Luis Ramirez, who is with Foods and Friends, which is a nonprofit organization similar to the one that I'm on the board for in Baltimore. But they're in the Washington area, and they deliver prepared meals and groceries to people living with HIV/AIDS and cancer and other life-challenging illnesses. He's also the president of Lambda Pride LGBT Network, and of course he was just introduced and talking a little bit about that. I want to once again thank you all for allowing me to address some questions with you today. Just to get us started, could everyone talk about any activity that you've had in your workplace where you actually helped initiate and or grow a more LGBT inclusive climate in your workplace? And I'll just ask Jeremy to start off with that. And anyone else, if you've got something particularly different to share, please add on.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Again, I'm Jeremy Gombin-Sperling. Pronouns are he, him, his. So as Lydia mentioned, I've been LGBTI inclusion, LGBTQ work has been a really huge part of just a lot of the different kind of professional opportunities that I've had. And it's something I've also really sought out as I've moved from different positions within mostly the realm of international education exchange. I think I'll focus the most for this conversation, I guess, I'll start with my work with as Lydia mentioned, what was called the LGBTI Public Diplomacy Working Group. I worked for 2 years at U.S. State Department in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs from 2014 to 2016. And that work was, I think, for me, really important and really powerful because, coming into that environment, I really did not know what to expect. I did not know what the environment for LGBTQ inclusion looked like in State Department. And one of the first things I did was I really sought out, what happened was that I realized that there was a diversity officer within the bureau I worked. And so I connected with that person and asked just very directly if there was any initiatives happening within our bureau for LGBTQ inclusion. There was mention automatically that another coworker had tried to get a working group together around these issues. And so through that person, I was able to connect. And slowly over time, we started building up this group. And the building of the group definitely took time, but what was really clear and apparent was that there was a lot of direct interest. It was once we sort of started advertising ourselves and having regular meetings and talking one-on-one with folks that we realized kind of how great the interest was and how folks who either identified as LGBTQ or as ally wanted to get involved. So I think what I'll name is just sort of what we really tried to do was create events and awareness so that we could have conversations around the importance of acknowledging LGBTQ issues, so issues of sexual orientation, gender identity within international exchange programs. State Department continues to run very large programs that connect folks from all around the world to either go from the United States outward or folks to come from around the world to the United States, and how important it is to understand both LGBTQ issues, but also the diversity of vocabulary and language we use to describe sexual orientation, gender identity. So our first event that we did was that we put on a panel of LGBTQ U.S. Alumni of U.S. State Department exchange programs. So we invited 3 of them to come down to the department and to share their experiences, what it was to be on these programs, what it was to navigate their identity of sexual orientation, gender identity, and other elements of who they are, religion, race, ability. And I feel as though, from that event, what my biggest takeaway was that people were just excited to hear stories. People were so it really touched people to hear the stories of the folks that we had on this panel, and it created even further momentum for some of the future work that we did. So I think what for me, coming away from that experience in particular, was that I learned the importance of creating space and trying to find support networks and allyship to create that space, and seeing how that helped us move a lot of our work forward. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. And I would like to apologize. One of the things that we mentioned earlier is that Shige has been responsible for establishing an event that is focused on pronoun awareness. And Shige's preferred pronouns are they and them. Just wanted to establish that. I would also like to hear from you at this time, Shige, if you have anything to add in terms of activities or work that you've done in the workplace where you helped initiate and grow a more inclusive climate.
Sure. I've been working here at University of Maryland for over 8 years now. And, we are, when you add in employees as well as students, we're around 50,000 people. And so the LGBT Equity Center, we've been around now, we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary. There's a lot of work to do. We do have a small staff of 3 full-time professionals and a grad assistant as our sort of regular staffing. And we're always trying to figure out, how do we create this impact? How do you create, climate change, culture change in a small city, basically? And so a lot of the way that I think we've been successful in initiating efforts with that regard, especially on trans issues over the last year and a half, are to really engage volunteers, really bring people together, ask people what they see as being some of the issues. And as we've done that, more people have sort of come out of the woodwork who say, well, I want to work on that, or I could volunteer to write some syllabus language that could be used about names and pronouns, and to direct people to resources. Or when it comes to demographic data collection on sexual orientation or gender identity, we had another person who said, I can help you draft some things. And of course, our own office, even with those resources, we're doing so many student programs and events and welcomes and fairs and graduation and all these other things. But to have volunteers feel that there are ways that we can engage and create that broader network has been super powerful, I think, to beginning to make some of these larger shifts. And through those partnerships, we've found, 60 different sites on campus, more than 60, that wanted to distribute materials. And so just that distribution network through a very large space has been super important, I think, to getting the message out, getting materials out, and bringing people together and creating some sense of like, what are the issues that matter? Why do they matter? How do I do the thing that I feel like is new to me and I don't know how to do it? And so making sure that we're communicating as well as possible.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? I would love to hear, Louise or Holly, anything that you've actually done in your workplace environment that helped you initiate or grow a more inclusive climate.
Sure, I'll just jump in. Hi, everyone. So at Accenture, we actually established an LGBT recruiting initiative that was specifically targeted at LGBTQ students and that demographic explicitly. I think the need is definitely there, that if you want to create an inclusive and diverse climate, recruiting is a good way to start it at an organization. You know, establishing that relationship up front and making sure the candidates know that where they're going is a place that they can be themselves and, you know, be unique and different, and it's actually embraced. We make a big effort to try to just emulate that type of environment, making everyone feel accepted for who they are. And so I think for us at Accenture, that was a good way to bridge that gap and start from the beginning of the relationship at the recruiting, from the first time that people meet us. And then hopefully once they become employees, they can see that we're an inclusive and diverse environment, and a company that embraces that uniqueness about each person.
That's very interesting, actually, starting from before they even sign up with Accenture. I would imagine that helps them make a decision about whether they're going to join, and perhaps encourages them. So that's a big plus.
Exactly.
Yeah, Louise, anything to add to that, or?
Just, I mean, I have something small. Well, small that I think, but we at Food and Friends is an organization that's really deeply rooted in the LGBT community. We started as a AIDS relief organization back to people, you know, particularly gay men back in the 80s and early 90s during the crisis in the city. So we have a big, our roots are planted there. So I'm lucky enough to be in the space that I feel comfortable talking about myself. But one of the things that we're doing now is including pronouns in our emails that are going out. And the reason that started is, you know, there's a lot of, you know, organizations that have already taken this on and doing it just in their daily communications. So when I noticed this, I submitted it to Food and Friends, our leadership team, just to let it know that it's an option for individuals to put on their email signatures or communications, to let them know that the organization from a leadership standpoint was you know, totally supportive of that. And while we didn't have anybody who was directly, you know, open about different pronouns, I think it's a great way to get that started. We want to be on the forefront of these kind of communications and movements. And it also, you know, when we start reaching out to the community, or when people are interested in joining our team, they see that we have this openness and this inclusivity. So it may seem like a small step, but in the future, it could be really important to somebody, and really a deciding factor about people who want to be on a team like ours, and being inclusive to different communities.
But thank you all. I want to move on to another question. And when Holly was speaking, she touched on this a bit, as far as at the outset, before a person joins an organization, addressing the LGBT friendliness within that organization. When applying for jobs, LGBT people often conceal information, as we all know, about their sexual orientation or gender identity from their resumes in order to avoid bias or discrimination. Can you all share your experience with seeking professional opportunities? How and when did you opt to disclose or acknowledge your identity within your organization? And what questions might you ask? What questions might a person ask, or what cues might they look for in an interview to help determine if the organization is LGBT inclusive? So anything that any of you could share that would cover all that. And Luis, if we could start with you, that would be great.
Sure. So again, like I have been fortunate to be in an organization that I know is very open and inclusive on different things like that. So I may not be the most
Right.
keen on that, but you know, it's really about comfortability. You don't want to be put into uncomfortable situations and put in a place, especially when you're starting early in your career and you're trying to navigate.
Yeah.
You know, definitely if you have some resources and can do some research on the place that you're going already to kind of get a sense of where they stand on things like that. But again, I've been lucky enough to be at the same place ever since I graduated. So, and if you can
Right.
find an organization like that, you know,
Thank you.
that's fantastic.
Jeremy, could you share a little bit about that at the State Department?
Yeah, and if it's okay, I think I'll just share, even actually going back to Maryland, when I first started at the University of Maryland, just because I feel like that's where I kind of began to develop some of the things I wanted to look out for in future positions. Yeah, no, I mean, so I think for me, what is something I learned in my first kind of job at Maryland was the ways in which some of the policies or anti-discrimination policies operate within our systems and everything. And that's something I think that I have become to be much more cognizant about as I continue to kind of grow in my career and work in different places. So for me, I think one thing that's helped me navigate is like, with Maryland, I at first did not realize when I started that, you know, we had, or the state, you know, anti-discrimination policy for folks based on sexual orientation, right? And then later on gender identity. And I want to name that because I think for me, it's really important that we also just consider the ways in which oftentimes LGBT can be viewed as just sort of one thing, but there's a vast diversity of identities, especially when we're talking about policies that impact us and how we are treated on our sexual orientation and on our gender identity. So for me as a cisgender person, identifying with the gender I was assigned at birth, you know, I was very concerned about how me showing up as a queer person would show up as, for example, in State Department. And so after being at Maryland and realizing these sort of policies, you know, I started having some questions kind of immediately. Because, you know, especially with the federal government, you know, not every single state, and I think many folks on this panel, as well as listeners may know, has state policies that protect folks for sexual orientation, gender identity. It may come down to maybe your institution or company does. And so one of the things that was really important for me that I learned early on was that at the time I was a federal contractor, and there was an executive order that had passed that had those anti-discrimination policies embedded in it at the time. So that was something that first gave me my first sense of, okay, this is a place where I see this in policy, and therefore I feel more confident that I may see it in practice. The next thing was actually when I got to my office was that there was a diversity statement, and very much a mission statement that very much clearly stated that, you know, we are here to accept and support all folks on our programs and and supporting our programs no matter sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, ability, race, nationality. And so those were things that, again, kind of helped me navigate that system a little bit. It was these sort of foundational policies that made me feel as though this is a space that is thinking about this, and also gave me space to sort of begin to ask those questions as well. And I would say in particular for myself, I've sort of developed a politic, and I think we all need to navigate this for ourselves a little bit about that question of disclosure. Seeing those things allowed me to feel comfortable when some of those conversations came up about perhaps a partner or things like that to say, oh, my boyfriend Eric, right? Having those kind of foundations gave me that space to do that. Does not mean that necessarily everyone will, but I think for me, seeing some of those forward-facing policies were really important for me to have that space to make that decision for myself if I feel I want to share this with folks, or if I need more time to, or if ultimately I decide to keep some of that to myself. So that really was my experience at the State Department with kind of growing into it. And then eventually once I realized that there also were people and folks with jobs dedicated to LGBTQ advocacy, I was like, oh my God, I feel even more supported. So it was this kind of this ongoing process where I kept kind of checking in with myself about where I wanted to be. And the other thing I think I'll say too is also just as I've developed networks with people is having other folks in my community to talk to about new places I may want to work. Because, you know, working in my field of international education exchange, we're a relatively small field, And by having a few folks who identify with the community who have been able to support me in either mentorship or other roles, it's allowed me to kind of go talk to those folks and like, I'm thinking about applying here. What is your knowledge base? What do you know about this place? Or can you connect me to somebody who does? And so that was another question I had as I went to the State Department. I knew a few people who had worked in the government off and on, and so being able to talk to them was also really important. So yeah, I think for me, thinking about policy, thinking about our networks, thinking about ourselves as a community, and developing my own sense of how I wanted to disclose and what I wanted to share about myself.
Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned a couple of statistics and talked about the difference between how your organization might have policies that are LGBT friendly, but it might lie in a state that does not. I came across a bit of interesting information, didn't know these numbers before, that there's no federal law protecting the rights of employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the United States. There is no state-level protection for sexual orientation in 28 of the 50 US states. And that means employees can be fired for being LGBT. There's no state-level gender identity protection in 30 of the 50 states. So in those states, employees can be fired for being transgender. And so, we can understand, why some of these are concerns and why this is something that really needs to be talked about more. I was hoping to also hear from Holly or Shige about, on the same question, basically. Just your experience in terms of seeking professional opportunities and how and when you opted to disclose your identity. And what any additional questions or cues that you might suggest that people look for in an interview to determine if the organization is LGBT inclusive.
Sure, I'll just jump in, Lydia. So yeah, definitely thanks for pointing out those statistics, because there are no federal protections for us across the board in the workplace. And I think it's usually company by company or within your organization, there might be protections. In most small companies, that doesn't exist. So when I started working years ago in 2002, I was living in San Antonio and I wasn't out at the time. At that time, it wasn't really okay and it wasn't a safe environment to be out. And so it's obviously gotten better, but it's still not there. Luckily, I ended up moving to the DC area and started at another company. And at first I wasn't out there either because I just needed to kind of feel comfortable and, gauge the environment. And usually you can tell through some conversations if a person is okay generally with gay people. And, through talking more and more with them, I came out slowly individually to some people. And then over time, I was just out to everyone. And I think for each person, it's really your journey. And when you feel it's right, normally I don't walk up to a person and just say, hi, my name's Holly and I'm gay. Because I don't think it's necessary. It doesn't define me. And I'm no different than the next person that's straight. And straight people don't do that normally. And so, you really have to make it your own decision internally. But luckily, nowadays, a lot of companies do disclose if they have inclusion and diversity initiatives within the company. And so when I'm researching whether to go to a new firm, I always look for that first. That's a really major criteria for me. And so for Accenture, for instance, they do have a strong LGBT initiative in place. And I think it's important that a company can say it publicly. That means they really stand behind it. And so if a person is looking at a new job, I would suggest they just do their research and start with a website and see how much they mention inclusion, diversity, and LGBTQ initiatives, and if they have a LGBT ERG group for their employees, and what are the types of benefits they might offer. Hopefully there's a comprehensive benefits package that addresses all of the services and support that we would need, and our partners. And then finally, Human Rights Campaign also has an equality index, workplace equality index, and so you can research larger companies there as well and see how they fare with policies and guidelines for their LGBT employees.
As a matter of fact, I noted that your organization, Accenture, has been recognized by the Human Rights Campaign for 10 years in a row of being noted as LGBT friendly. So I thought that was a big plus. I put that plug in for Accenture and for you
Thanks.
as well.
Thank you.
I was looking at a little bit more information that some of our participants might find interesting, and that is that today more Fortune 500 companies offer benefits to their LGBT employees. As of 2017, 91% of Fortune 500 companies have non-discrimination policies that include sexual orientation. So, you know, and hey, one of the reasons they're in the Fortune 500 maybe. And 83% have non-discrimination policies that include gender identity. 60% of the Fortune 500 companies include domestic partner benefits, and 58% include transgender inclusive benefits. Still a good bit of work to do though, because still few companies offer LGBT inclusive family leave, and so that's something that I noted also as I was reading. Shige, did you have? Would love it if you had anything to add to how and when you opted to disclose your identity, and any questions or suggestions you might have for things for people to look for as they're considering joining an organization.
I mean, I think because my career has been focused on LGBT issues over 15 years, pretty much people assume that I am LGBT, but I don't always have to explain what parts of LGBT I identify with. And being trans and non-binary, I think like there are different workplace experiences. I go by they, them pronouns. I want people to use those pronouns to refer to me. And I think that a lot of people, whether they aren't used to that or don't understand that, that's an issue. And even among people I know in fairly progressive higher education space doing this kind of work of LGBT issues, you know, I've had caucus meetings with other professionals that do similar work to me who are trans identified. And, you know, like people almost in tears over workplace situations, even folks that do LGBT work, about simply feeling respected in the workplace, their boss or their boss's boss, understanding them on a basic level and communicating using the right name, using the right pronouns. I've seen in even trying to look at job applications at even fairly inclusive institutions, what gender can I mark, right? The best that I've seen in a lot of the places I've looked at, like big employers, is that I can choose not to say what my gender is, but then I'm given only 2 binary options of it. And so this is something that I see, like, certainly it faces me. And when do I disclose what pronouns that I go by? And for me, it's important to be upfront because I don't want to be in a terrible environment. I've been fortunate and I think to be in an environment where, I also legally changed my name recently, and people were really quick to adapt to my workplace and very supportive. And, even when people make mistakes, correcting themselves or saying to a colleague, oh, actually Shige goes by they, them, or their name is Shige now, or whatever that it might be, to kind of make things feel really welcoming to me. It's been great. And so I don't really want to go to another place where I'm going to learn that like people don't really care or don't really want to work on that. And so I include my pronouns in my cover letter by my signature. I include it on my resume by my name because I think it's important to put it out front. At the same time, you're citing these statistics, and I know the reality. DC Office of Human Rights, and I happen to live in the district, is I think one of the first or only, first places in the world to do a resume study on trans issues specifically, where they sent out resumes to different employers to test them to see, you know, if we just have one detail that's different, that this person was involved in a trans organization versus involved in like a leftist political organization was their control group. And they found that there was discrimination against people that were affiliated with trans organizations, to the point that they felt they actually, normally they would just do this as like a study to learn things, but they actually had to take action against specific employers as a result of their study and some of the like extreme differences they were finding in the way that people were being treated. So I know that like putting myself out there means that I'm going to face discrimination, but also I don't want to be in a terrible environment, and I'm privileged enough to be in an environment now that works well enough for me. And so it's, I think for trans folks, there's a lot of negotiation. You know, what works for me is not going to be what works for another person. And there's a lot of other things to look at, especially like health insurance benefits. Many companies do not cover gender affirming care in their policies. And so you've got to ask specific questions, or even if you don't want to bring it out there publicly or with the hiring officials, that's something you're looking at, you know, to get those policy documents to the extent that you can get access to them and see, because that could really affect your life greatly.
I really appreciate that. And would you mind also sharing, I know it's in October, the date of International Pronouns Day, and I appreciate you because I was only first introduced to the idea 2 years ago, actually here on campus, when I came to a training class that you facilitated.
Sure. So there's a couple of resources. One is mypronouns.org, which is a website I had actually just made as a spare time project, because I know a lot of people have questions. How do I do this? What if I make a mistake? How do I handle these various scenarios? How do I ask about pronouns? So there's a lot of detailed information, scenarios and examples and scripts that people can essentially use to learn about it at that website. And that's become something that people are actually able to use links from that site in their email signatures as a way to point to that resource and information. And then, and I created that about 1.5 years ago. And then a couple months ago, I started working with colleagues at other universities and then other places, because we at University of Maryland have been doing a Pronouns Day since 2016 of our own. And that was done through the Rise Above initiative. There were a lot of students involved. It was an idea I had suggested because I thought that this was a key issue that I kept hearing over and over again from students and from others, from employees, that this is something we should think about. So it's become this international thing now where we've got probably almost 200 endorsers for it, including many national, international organizations. And you can find out more about that on pronounsday.org, and it's going to be on Wednesday, October 17th. So there's a number of businesses. There's even like government and council in Scotland that signed on as an endorser. There's like a trans organization in India. There's like so many groups in the US, probably over 50 college and university groups. So many that have been engaging with that. And there's lots of ways that I'm hoping alumni on this call, if that's something that you think might be useful in your organization, that you can take a look at.
Thank you so much. If we could talk a little further about the situation that transgender people face, and this is a little bit of a lengthy question, but bear with me because it's got some information I would appreciate if you all would address. Transgender people whose sexuality has nothing to do with the discrimination they encounter face further stigma still due to a widespread lack of understanding of the issue. Many choose to leave their workplace in order to undergo transition. Some other statistics I came across, research indicates that transgender workers are especially vulnerable to discrimination. 27% of the population said that they were not hired, were fired, or were not promoted in 2015 due to their gender identity or expression. Also, 80% of the transgender population who were employed in 2015 experienced harassment or mistreatment on the job, or took steps to go out of the way, had to do something in order to sort of protect themselves against it. If you all would please talk about any observations that you've made where environments might be already described as gay friendly, and I say that, you know, they think they're gay friendly, but made a distinction with how they were inclusive of transgender workers. And here's the last bit of it. What specific recommendations would you have for employees or job seekers who identify as transgender or intersex? And how would you advise employers on becoming more educated and inclusive? So talk anywhere around any of that topic.
I'll say a few things about, because you brought up laws and policies, so I want to say a little bit about that, and then maybe others have their observations and can share lots of other things. But you've cited some of the things. Yes, there are not like explicit federal protections, but there's a lot of ways that people have also sought protection utilizing sex anti-discrimination law to interpret that as inclusive of whether it's trans people or gay or bisexual people, lesbians, that people have been successful also in court, even though we don't have like explicit legal protections of some of these categories to take these things and say, look, you cover sex, and you know, why would you treat me this way? If my sex were this other sex or gender, then why would my partner have a problem here, right? Or gender stereotypes. So there's a lot also in policy. One of the things to look at in policy that I think is really useful is DC has a really great set of regulations. So they passed the human rights law in 2005, 2006, and then a series of regulations. And so what happens is many employers may have gender identity and expression or some combination of things in their policy. But like, what does that mean? Like, have they actually done the work even? So even places that say that they're trying to not discriminate, what is the work then that actually specifies what it means to have such a policy? So in Washington, D.C., and I cite it because I think it's one of the strongest sets of regulations that came from a human rights law that delineates that having such a law means single-user restrooms should be labeled in a gender-neutral way, that misusing, especially intentionally, repeatedly, somebody's name or pronoun could be evidence of discriminatory harassment, right? So they've named these things really specifically in their regulations, and that's not something I've seen in a lot of places. So whether it's naming it in a set of policies or regulations, or just having better practices in place that actually show that you've done work around pronouns or trans health care or restrooms and signage. All of those things, I think, are things that people should be looking at, and not just like, oh, they have a policy that says they're inclusive, or look, the acronym includes trans or intersex, but like, what is it that you're actually doing?
Thank you. Holly, anything that you could add as far as Accenture or any other experience as far as recommendations that you would have for employees or job seekers who identify as transgender or intersex? Has your the organization that you're a part of within Accenture addressed that much, or anything that you have to share about that?
Yes, we have, and actually I agree. So the pronoun distinction has been adopted. We have people pages, and it's a place where it kind of just describes you as an individual, and you can note your preferred pronoun and how you identify. You can also include that on your email signature so that people know, and right up front they know how to address you. I think also for other organizations, if they haven't already adopted that, that's a good starting point. We also have the neutral gender bathrooms at our Glebe office. And so those individuals can, freely, use whatever bathroom they would like. And so I think just simple things like that could kind of do wonders. It's just a start. And I think just honestly creating an open, inclusive, acceptable environment to just discuss the topic is also a good starting point. You know, if employers and leadership just, you know, open up that discussion and have a comfortable place for people to talk freely and, you know, just also just candidly ask how they would like to be referred, just so that you don't make the mistake and then make an assumption. I think a lot of times people assume, in a lot of cases, whether it's a trans person or even a lesbian or a gay person, that, you know, we're all straight until we tell you otherwise. And so, you know, just ask if you don't know. I think that's like a good starting point. Have that dialogue up front.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, would you have anything to chime in on with this discussion, as far as any observations in environments where you worked, whether it's State Department, where people are sort of adapting to, getting used to, or not quite as ready to, you know, have an understanding about transgender colleagues, or any recommendations that you would make for employees in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this, I think actually this is through all my work in diversity and inclusion, just through the lens of privilege and marginalization, because I think there's a lot of self-work that folks, especially in the spectrum of gender, for folks in particular myself, who identify as cisgender, there's a lot of self-work that I think that we also can do at an individual level to think about that, right? Because I think many of us, like I think about it with race, like many white folks do not necessarily take the time or have thought about what it is to be white in this world. And the same thing about with our gender identity. So I think, you know, for us to even just sort of take a moment to think to ourselves and ask, like, have I ever really thought about what it means to never have my gender questioned or thought about, or be in a space always have policies that are supported? And on top of that, I think that there's a lot of, in that individual work that we can do. I mean, there's organizations like the National Center for Transgender Equality, GLAAD also, and GLAAD in particular, also like have really strong resources that are readily available online that do a lot of work around vocabulary, do a lot of work on introduction to a lot of these issues. Because sometimes what can happen, especially if there may be a person within an organization who's trans and or gender nonconforming, sometimes it's easy for organizations to see them as the hub for all of the education. And that's a lot of pressure and burden to put on an individual. So that's where I'm thinking also about the ways which organizations can work to push their employees to sort of take the time to get to know the information, whether it's through initial HR trainings, whether that's through just sort of resources that we provide kind of readily for folks as a way to create space and also make it known that's important, that we want everyone to be thinking about these things, and we want everyone to be doing this sort of work to familiarize ourselves with a lot of these areas and these different identities, whether or not we identify with them or not. And I think for me, I've over time become to realize just, you know, how important things like yes, in making sure everyone includes their pronouns in their business cards, in their signature, which are maybe small things, but, you know, something I've learned even just as a teacher here is having those conversations with students that open the door a lot of times. Doesn't mean it always will, but I think that there are just certain things that we do as folks, in particular cisgender folks, as a way to sort of better open that door and as a way to show that it's important to us to create more of that community. And also says that the burden of creating those spaces not necessarily fall on any transgender folks that are in that organization. So that's something that I am thinking about a lot right now. And something that I think that organizations and employers, employees can also do themselves as a way to sort of continue to foster inclusion. Because I guess for what I'm trying to get at is that it's one thing to have that policy. I feel like as Shige and Holly and Louise have mentioned, it's one thing to have those pronouns, but to really understand and feel the importance of it is another step that I think is incredibly important for any sort of inclusion.
So even simply put, it's really nice to talk the talk, but also to walk the walk, basically. It's kind of what it boils down to.
I'll say feel the feel, but yes.
Yes. And I know, Louise, that you're in an environment that is, you know, obviously, just based on the folks who are involved, is already very open and friendly to LGBTQ, if not really part of its culture and part of its environment. Anything that you would point out, even in that environment, that is specific to specific concerns for people who identify as trans?
You know, I'm pretty lucky. I haven't really seen any kind of situations like that, and I haven't felt uncomfortable disclosing my my identity and my sexual identity, things of that nature. But just because you're in a good place doesn't mean you can't make things better. You know, I think it's safe to say that we're all kind of leaders in our own respective areas, and I think it's important to always be asking the question, what can you do to make things, you know, more comfortable for people, more open, more accepting. We get a lot of, you know, volunteers who come through here, so we get a range of people, you know, coming from all different backgrounds and things like that. So you want to make sure that you already have things in place that are going to make people feel comfortable and open. So, you know, simple things like, you know, adding your pronouns to your emails. You know, it also, you know, opens up a dialogue. A lot of people who have started noticing that have asked questions like, hey, what is this? What does that mean? And it opens a discussion that you can, you know, maybe talk to somebody who you know, didn't realize that this was an important thing that we should be looking into. But, you know, even, you know, we would like to improve on our bathroom situation here. We don't necessarily have a gender neutral restroom, but that's something we would like to do, you know, figuring out, you know, logistically how that's going to look first. But, you know, just because things are good doesn't mean that we have to stop working. We want to keep working to make sure that our policies stay up to date and that our space is open and comfortable for everybody who may come through.
And I'm not sure if our alumni on the call happen to know, but I do believe, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, that either every building currently has or will have at least one restroom that is the general restroom and can be used by anyone. I do want to check in with Aubrey and see if we have got any questions from any of the callers. If you just want to turn it over to you, and very, very much thank Jeremy, Holly, and Shigeru and Luis for your contributions, for your comments, and for sharing your information. I appreciate you.
Yes, thank you so much to our panel and to Lydia for moderating. We do have a couple of minutes here at the end for some Q&A from any of our attendees. So if you do have a question, there is a Q&A box that is at the bottom of the control panel. And the way to access that control panel for you is simply moving your cursor over the webinar. So I'll allow just a minute or two here for any audience questions. I do have a question just in terms of, with respect to allyship in the workplace. Is there anything, or are there any takeaways that the panel would mind sharing, just things that stick out to you as really great examples of what that allyship looks like and how to foster more of an inclusive community with everybody? Is there anything, like any stories you'd like to share, or tidbits that are really impactful and have had really a lot of impact and all that stuff on what you go through in the workplace?
Sure, I can jump in. We have an ally program, and I think it's a great way to bring some of our straight allies into the conversation. A lot of times they do want to help the gay community and understand better. They just don't know how. And so by having this ally program, it gives us the support we need because we can't do it alone. Obviously, there's a lot of initiatives in equality and gay rights and things like that we need our straight allies' help. So I think, first off, if an organization doesn't have an ally program, it's a great way to engage the other side to help us. And it just, again, gives them an outlet to communicate and just talk freely about these issues and topics. And for instance, at Accenture, we can delegate whether you're an ally a few different ways. You can note it in your email signature. You can put it on your people page, and we actually even give people badges to wear on their lanyard. So when they're walking around the office, in addition to the normal badge that you'll have with your name, you'll have an ally badge. And so if a person, you know, is kind of in a tough spot or needs some extra assistance, and they need like a straight ally, they can reach out to that person and have that comfortable conversation. And a lot of times, I think the straight allies can sometimes bridge that gap and talk with other straight people about our issues, and it's weird, but sometimes they understand it better. So I think an ally program is definitely a great start to just, you know, all being human together and understanding each other's issues and knowing that we want to be treated fairly just like everyone else and have the protections and the equal benefits and rights, and just doing the right thing, you know, not to leave anyone out. So that's what I would say about it.
Wonderful. It looks like we've covered all of our questions. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to see if there's anything on the panel that you guys wanted to share or address before I hand it over to Luis for some final remarks from Lambda Pride.
If no one else has anything, I'm going to share a super quick story, and this is something I'm proud of. I've got a 17-year-old kid, a boy, and he's looking at colleges. He's looking at an all-men's university, where recently there were some events that were publicized because it's an all-male university, and there are some students there who are trans. And another adult questioned my child as to why he would want to go to that school. And my child, because he was raised right, I guess, responded, he just wants to get his education, and there's space everywhere for everyone, and no matter who was on campus or what was going on, that wasn't going to keep him from getting his education. And so he sort of pushed back at that adult. And the more those kinds of conversations happen, I think that the more, you know, understanding will grow. And the faster they happen, maybe it won't take, you know, centuries. So just wanted to toss that out there because we had free time at the end. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Aubrey.
Well, I just want to actually say one more thing. This is actually coming off of what Luis said. I think it can be easy, and understandably so, to think a lot about how far we've come in certain areas of inclusion, especially on issues regarding sexual orientation, gender identity. And I think, it's very important also for folks, especially those that are in power, and even folks that are looking for jobs too, to think about where we can go. I think constantly having that lens about where else do we need to, where else are we not thinking about, where can our practices continue to thrive? Like, what are other things that we want to do or say that we have wanted to do but have not done yet? I think because it's important to recognize and acknowledge a lot of the work that's gone in different organizations and places to where they're at. And that impetus of where we want to go, I think, is so powerful and important because it makes us never stop thinking about, okay, how can we continue to support our trans and gender non-conforming colleagues and friends? How can we support to continue to support our lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual friends and colleagues? So I just want to echo Luis. I really appreciate you bringing that point about what can we continue to do better. Let's see where we've come from. Let's acknowledge it, and let's continue to hold and think about where next we want to go with things.
I love that, and thank you, Jeremy, for sharing, and Lydia, thank you for sharing that story. Before we wrap up here, we have about a minute or so. Luis, I just wanted to hand it over to you for any final remarks from Lambda Pride, any reminders, anything that you want to share.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. We might wait for a second, but I just want to address the audience that I will be sharing a follow-up email later today. If you'd like to have a private discussion with one of our panelists today or a moderator, I will share their contact information to get in touch with them. So please feel free to reach out and start that conversation. Looks like Luis is back, so I'll hand it back over to you one last time.
Sorry about that. My office building has been experiencing power outages today, so they've been doing testing of the systems and intercom tests. So sorry about that. But I just want to say thank you again for having me here and for all the panelists participating today. Again, as president of Lambda Pride, the LGBTQ plus Alumni Association, we would love to hear from you, and we would love to work with all of you who are on the call today to stay connected to the university, but in a fun and engaging way to work with each other to create a great open networking space, but also to continue to foster this incredible relationship that the University of Maryland has put in all of us. So if you're interested, again, on September 6th at the LGBT Equity Center on campus from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m., we will be doing an information session more about Lambda Pride, about some of the initiatives that we'd like to cover, as well as open volunteer and leadership opportunities to get involved. So we would love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you and have you participate in any capacity. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luis. And thank you so much to Lydia, to Shige, to Jeremy, to Holly. I really appreciate having you all on today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful day and go Terps.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.